Chapter 13, Dead Air. Good morning and welcome to Kids View, featuring the students of Centennial Park School. I'm your host, Benjamin Driver. We've got a great show for you today, so let's get right into it. Our first guest is Arthur Katz with the weekly commentary. What have you got to talk to us about today, Arthur? Arthur was already seated at the guest broadcast desk. Sound, he blurted out passionately. Sound? Oh, sure. I'll bet you think sound's just great. Beautiful music, tweeting birds in the meadow, the sizzling of bacon frying on the stove. He snorted in disgust. Aren't we forgetting a little something? Like ultrasonic sound waves that can kill, kill, kill. Oh, said Benji, those. Yeah, those. Not so smug anymore, huh? And the worst part is that ultrasound is so high-pitched that you can't even hear it. So you never know when it's coming to get you. Pretty big problem, right? Well, do you ever hear about it on the evening news? No, they're sweeping this one under the carpet just because no one has ever actually been harmed by ultrasonic sound waves. They want to wait for the crisis and grab the headlines. What are we going to do about it? Mark stood outside Miss P's apartment, blow dryer at the ready, and flicked the on switch. Oh, I hate this radio, came a muffled cry from within. Mark smiled proudly. That was becoming almost a catchphrase, and he had started it. He was still smiling a moment later when the door of 4-H was flung open, and the teacher herself stood there staring at him, the radio under her arm. Mesmerized with shock, he automatically bent his wrist and turned the dryer toward his own head. Miss P, he exclaimed. What are you doing here? I live here, she said, eyes narrowing. More to the point, what are you doing here? Well, said Mark, fluffing up his hair with his free hand. I was in the neighborhood, so I just figured I'd drop in and blow dry your hair in my hall, she finished coldly. Right, stammered Mark, and now I gotta go. Face flaming red, he took off down the stairs, the dryer still running in his hand. What Miss P thought of him didn't matter anymore. The important thing was to get to the studio and warn Benji that the jig was up. His flight was stalled at the corner of Kant and Main, where a sudden traffic jam ground everything to a halt. A traffic jam on Saturday morning. Mark looked up to see that all the traffic lights had gone dead. In horror, he stared at the hairdryer in his hand, still running. This was his fault. Guiltily, he flipped the switch to the off position. The traffic lights came on again. When the crosswalk had cleared, he darted off in the direction of the studio. Boy, oh boy, it was a good thing he'd noticed that in time. A couple of blocks closer, and he would have put WGRK off the air again. Then he'd have been dead for sure. He thought of Miss P, as opposed to just probably. By the time Arthur finished his commentary and returned to the waiting room, all 12 members of the second grade choral reading club were in tears. What happened? Asked Arthur, mystified. Brad Jaworski supplied the answer. Some idiot just went on the radio and told them that ultrasound is coming to scramble their brains. And you can't even hear it, wailed a little boy. On the air, Mr. Whitehead's recorded voice was telling everyone that a house was not a home without a pet. The sponsor himself had come back with Winston Churchill. He was now placing the cage under the host's broadcast desk. We're doing the quiz next, Benji explained, and then there's no commercial break before the mascot of the week. When it's over, you can take Winston Churchill and run right back to the store to greet all the excited customers. From your mouth to God's ears and around the corner to the bank, said the sponsor devoutly. Murph finished installing the trivia quiz phone on Benji's broadcast desk. Okay, Mr. Whitehead, we have to go back into the booth now. 10 seconds, Benji. Benji sat down behind the microphone and began to shuffle through the stack of file cards he and Ellen Louise had prepared earlier. The on-air light popped on. We continue with Kids View's famous trivia quiz, Venice's #1 radio contest, where our listeners can test their skill and win valuable prizes. Remember, the number is 555-5074. And here's question number 1. What substance gives plants their green color? The telephone rang, and as Benji reached for it, a terrible sight met his eyes. Mark Havermeyer, red-faced and disheveled, was in the studio control room, pressed up against the glass, signaling madly. For an instant, Benji froze. If Mark was here, that meant Miss P could very well be listening to her radio. And he had already asked the first question. In a daze, he picked up the phone. "Kids View, you're on the air." "Chlorophyll," came a voice. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Chlorophyll. Do you have the answer to question 1? "That's it. Chlorophyll. My name's Watkins." "Oh, right. Congratulations, Mr. Watkins. You've just won a dog dish in your choice of 3 decorator colors." As he continued to chat with the caller about his prize, Benji kept a sharp eye on Ellen Louise and Mark, who were having a frantic conversation behind the soundproof glass. They must have decided something, because they tiptoed into the studio and stood by his desk, waving their arms at him. "Oh, congratulations again, sir." Benji was stalling until he could figure out what Ellen Louise and Mark were trying to tell him. "You must be so thrilled." "I won a dog dish, not a Rolls Royce," said Mr. Watkins, and hung up. "And now," said Benji, "on to question 2. He gave the other 2 producers one last beseeching look and opened his mouth to read the question. "How many—" Suddenly the control room door flew open and in burst Ms. P, hair bouncing, eyes blazing. And there was Benji, halfway through her second question. "Apples," he blurted out. "Yeah, how many apples, in a dozen?" Inwardly, he berated himself. What a stupid question. But under the circumstances, it was better than nothing. Desperately, he pushed the stack of 3x5 question cards toward Ellen Louise and Mark. Ellen Louise understood perfectly. She crossed out the old questions and began to think up questions of her own. Benji carried on. "Kids View, you're on the air." "I'm Mrs. Mezzenscheffer, and I guess 12, said the caller. "Right," said Benji. "A trick question, handled expertly by, you. And you've won tail rot medicine for your fish tank. Enjoy." And here's question 3. Breathing a silent prayer, he took the card from Ellen Louise's outstretched hand and read, "How do crickets chirp?" Hey, not bad. His pulse slowed a little. The phone rang too quickly. Ellen Louise hadn't even started on question 4. "They chirp by rubbing their legs together," came the correct answer. In no time, the congratulations were given, the lizard vitamins awarded, and there was Benji with no question 5. "Isn't this fun?" he informed the listeners while gesturing pleadingly at Ellen Louise. She was writing madly but was not ready. Then it occurred to him. What was the one subject about which Benji was a walking encyclopedia? Okay, next question. Where did legendary radio personality Eldridge Kestenbaum receive his college degree? For the first time since the quiz had begun 5 weeks earlier, the phone was silent. Benji was horrified. Doesn't anybody know? 5 seconds more. No? 2 seconds. Well, I'm afraid we've got no winner. The answer is the South Chesterland Correspondence School of Broadcasting and Law Maintenance, of course. By that time, Ellen Louise had finally finished another question, but Kids View was not out of the woods yet. Miss P was still in the control room, looking daggers at them through the glass. Benji's thoughts were in turmoil. What did the teacher know? Why had she come to the station? What had happened with Mark and the hairdryer? "Congratulations, Mrs. Smith," he was saying. "This week's poop scoop is yours." "Come on, Ellen, hurry. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for supporting the quiz." Mark was drenched with sweat, ignoring the broadcast and watching Ms. P turn an unhealthy shade of purple in the control room. He had to talk to Benji, but in the middle of the show, that was impossible. Urgently, he snatched up a file card, scribbled his message, and tossed it onto the deck. Benji sighed with relief and picked it up. In a flash of exquisite horror, Mark realized that Benji was about to read his note on the air. He had mistaken it for question 6. "This is for a lovely imitation pearl handle cat brush," announced Benji. He read, "Do you think she knows we've been using her seminar questions for the quiz?" Benji was turned to stone. He had the feeling that he could reach for those words and cram them back into his mouth, but his arm wouldn't move. So they hung there, echoing in the studio, and seemed to settle on the wall, where they burned in letters of flame. His eyes, like saucers, locked on Miss P, who stared back like a cobra hypnotizing its prey. His whole career at Kidsview flashed before his eyes. Was this to be his last broadcast? Would Ms. P have him thrown off the show? Or send a note home to his parents who would make him quit? What was Benji without radio? He felt an insistent tugging at his arm and looked at Ellen Louise. She was pointing frantically at the microphone, and suddenly it hit him. The red light was still on, and no one was saying anything. He, Benjamin Driver, was leaving dead air. He reacted instantly and, abandoning the quiz, shouted, "And now it's time for the mascot of the week." With a wildly flailing arm, he grabbed Winston Churchill's cage and hauled it out from under the desk. But he yanked too hard, and the door came off in his hand. A blur of orange and green shot out of the cage and began to flap around the studio. "Winston!" cried Ellen Louise in horror. "Get him!" bellowed Mark, diving for the bird and landing flat on his face on the guest broadcast desk. "And now the mascot of the week is flying around the studio," shouted Benji, showing everyone his beautiful feathers. He grabbed for the parrot and missed. Suddenly, a burst of machine gun fire rang out in the studio. The producers wheeled. Winston Churchill sat perched atop the sound effects console, pecking at buttons with his beak. In rapid succession, a rooster crowed, a siren wailed, and a crowd of about 50,000 people cheered. Big Ben struck 1 o'clock, tires squealed, and glass shattered. There were hoofbeats and the opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. A cork popped, and champagne splashed into glasses, followed by the mating call of the great horned owl. Mark lunged at the sound effects console, but the parrot cleverly swooped over his head, circled once, and landed back on the lever that activated the laugh track. Chuckles and guffaws bubbled up in the studio. Throwing up his hands in dismay, Murph hit play on the studio stereo and put Kidsview off the air. On the monitors and on radios tuned to FM 92.5 all over town, the studio mayhem stopped abruptly and was replaced by a man's voice which said, "Bonjour, mademoiselle. Vous êtes très jolie." Mark's 2 hands shot up in the air. "I didn't do it. I wasn't even in the control room." The waiting room door swung open and in peered Arthur Katz. "Hey, what's going on?" Winston Churchill swooped at him, sending him diving to the floor. All 12 members of the second grade choral reading group trampled over him and began to chase the parrot around the studio. Mr. Whitehead came roaring out of the control room. "Remember, you kill it, you've bought it." Murph and Miss P were hot on his heels. "What a wonderful parrot he is, ladies and gentlemen," announced Benji into the microphone. "Can he ever fly?" "Save it, driver," said Brad, who was leaning against the studio wall. a disgusted expression on his face. "You're off the air." "Winston, come here," cried Ellen Louise. She launched herself at the bird just as Mark did the same from the opposite side. The two met head on with a resounding conk and fell back, stunned. Winston Churchill fluttered down to the sound effects console once again and began a mad tap dance on the buttons. There was the sound of cows mooing, more machine gun fire, the buzzing of bees, and shuffling cards. A toilet flushed, and someone danced a soft shoe as a single-engine warplane circled overhead. Throughout all this, the laugh track giggled on, until Winston Churchill kicked the lever to maximum. "Somebody stop that bird," called Murph. There was a stampede for the sound effects console, but at that moment, one of the second graders got his foot tangled in the power cables. Down he went, and as he fell, his entire marble collection, the biggest in Centennial Park School, spilled out of his jacket pocket. Advancing feet tripped up on the marbles, and bodies squirmed all over the floor as Winston Churchill quickened his dance. The sounds were practically one on top of the other now, and growing louder, as the parrot seemed to have done something to the volume control. Bells rang, bullets flew, and thunder crashed as the laugh track howled. Clocks ticked, crowds cheered, dogs barked, brakes squealed, trees fell, jets roared, women screamed, and hundreds of other sounds blended together into one horrible din. Murph was floundering on the floor, trying to regain his balance. "Get that bird off the equipment." Benji made a run at the console, but he too slipped on the marble collection. He landed on the floor beside a struggling Miss P. Hastily, he squirmed away, almost swimming. In the control room, Mr. Morenz looked up from Space Llama and viewed the studio chaos with a worried frown. Then he shrugged, shook himself all over, and returned to his reading. If he was needed, he would be summoned. "Look!" screamed Mark. Above the console, where the parrots still pecked and scrambled, a plume of smoke rose and hung in the air. "It's going to overload!" cried Murph. "Stop that bird!" All sound effects died suddenly, to be replaced by a louder, more painful noise. It was the screech of audio feedback, swelling and climbing higher in pitch. Hands flew to cover sensitive ears. Arthur Katz leaped to his feet. "Ultrasonic sound waves!" he howled in terror. "Run for your lives!" Squealing all the way, the 12 second graders evacuated the building, leaving Arthur once again flattened in the waiting room doorway. The feedback was deafening now, and the smoke was beginning to fill the whole studio. "Do something!" begged Murph. Calmly, Brad Jaworski reached down, picked up a thick black cable, and pulled plug and socket apart. Silence fell in the studio. Murph flushed bright red. Bored with the console, Winston Churchill fluttered down to the ground. He hopped up on Miss P's arm, peered into her face, and announced, "Gosh, you're beautiful." The teacher stared in shock, then broke into a deep, lighted smile. "How much does he cost?" she called. $195, came Mr. Whitehead's muffled voice from under the broadcast desk. "Oh," she sighed, "I really can't go any higher than 150. "Sold!" croaked Benji Driver.